Hi Algebra 1 students, welcome to our first video recording. Today I'm going to go over section 10.3 notes, and our learning target for today is looking at what is called measurements of central tendency. And so three terms that you're going to be able to identify when we're done with this set of notes are mean, median, and mode. These are all ways that we can give a general representation of a set of data. So our first example that we're going to take a look at to identify these three terms is, let's say we collected the shoe size of 8 students in the class. So somebody had a size 3, 6.5, 7, 7, and so on. Okay. So the first term that we're going to take a look at is the mean. And so the mean for any data set is just finding the average of all of that data set. So the way that we find the mean for anything is we add together all of the elements in that set. So if I add together all of these shoe sizes that are listed above, the sum of all those values is 60.5. And so I just did that by adding 3 plus 6.5 and so on. So then to find the average, I just take that sum and I divide by the total number of elements, which in this case is 8. And so when I do that divide, I get approximately 7.56. And so this right here represents the mean or the average of this data set. Okay, and we'll talk at the very end and kind of look at all three of these measurements of central tendency to determine which one is maybe the best representation and in which situations where you might get a different one. Second measurement of central tendency that we're going to look at is something called the median. And so the median is literally you put your data in order from smallest to largest or largest to smallest, and you pick the exact middle number. Now there are two different scenarios that can happen. If there are an odd number of elements, you just literally choose the middle number, and that's your median. If there's an even number of elements, you choose the two middle numbers and find their average by adding them together and dividing by 2. So if we look at our data set, we have 8 elements on here. So my two middle elements are going to be 7 and 8.5. So since there's an even number, I'm going to take and add together those two and find the average, and that will be my median. So 7 plus 8.5 is going to give me 15.5. And when I go ahead and divide that by 2, I get 7.75. And that's my median. So the last measurement of central tendency that we're going to look at here is the mode. The mode is going to be the number that occurs the most often in your data set. So if we take a look at our data set here, the number that's occurring the most often is 7. It's occurring twice. It is possible with a data set to have no mode. And that's just if no number occurs more often than another. So it's the mode because it occurs the most often. Okay, and again, it's possible for a data set to have no mode. Last piece that we're looking at, this can really help you to identify which measurement of central tendency is the best representation of your data by looking at the range of your data set. So you find the range by just having your data again in order from smallest to largest, and you take the smallest value and the largest value and you find the difference between the two. So our range for this is going to equal 10 minus 3, or 7. This just tells you how closely related all of your data is. So in this case, our shoe sizes are not that far apart from each other, with the range only being 7. Sometimes you might have a large discrepancy with your range, and if that's the case, oftentimes the mean is not going to necessarily be the best representation of your data set. Okay, so let's just go through all three of those measurements of central tendency one more time. So when you're looking at a data set, typically the first thing that you want to do is make sure that you have it in order from smallest to largest. So I'm going to take this data set and just rewrite it in order from smallest to largest. So the first one that we're going to identify is our mean. So remember, to find the mean, we find the sum of all of the elements in our data set. So if I add all of these elements up, my sum is 124. In this example, again, there are 8 numbers that we're going to find the average of. So I divide by 8, and my mean ends up being 15.5. Okay, the median, remember, is that middle number. So in this case, if I look at my 2 middle numbers here, they would be 15 and 16. And so I find the average of them if there's an even number of elements, when there's not an exact middle number. And so if I take 15 plus 16 and divide that by 2, my median is actually also 15.5. Okay, and then the mode for this data set is the number that occurs the most often, and that's 15. And last but not least, my range is going to be my largest element minus my smallest element, which is 10. So in this case, the mean, median, and mode all are good representations of this data set. An example of one where one might be a better representation than another is, let's say you have student test scores, and let's say most of the students score somewhere between 80 to 90 on that test, but you had 1 or 2 students that scored, let's say, 15 out of 100. If you find the average, those small test scores of 15 to 20 are going to really have an effect on the overall average. So that might not necessarily be the best representation, and maybe that middle number, your median, is a better representation. All right, folks, have fun working on the homework assignment, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll be available on Zoom for office hours.